How's everybody doing? Hanging in there? I always think of that kitty holding on for dear life. And underneath it always says, hang in there. Well, good news is, of course, we have a week off next week. So, time to recuperate, recharge, and so on. As we get ready here to get started. Wait a minute or so. We have 3 presenters today. Oh, wow.
Very.
Somewhere, hopefully.
Thanks for all the shirk help.
Oh yeah, nothing more frantic than a short week. That's for sure. My goodness. Okay, so as people are coming in, I will just say, I think importantly to keep your eyes on the rest of the semester and paper topics, papers for this class. So let me say a few words about that. The paper is 20-ish pages, and there is an abstract due, not until November 13th, so it's still down the road, but I'm sure it'll come faster than we anticipate. And the idea for this paper is that it is a theory paper. So you are the theorist and you're writing a theory paper. So it's probably quite different than what you've mostly written, which would be literature papers or literary analysis. This is theory or theory analysis. And you... So with... Kelly gets settled in. I'm just reminding everyone about the paper. It's a theory paper, and it really means you will do the work of close reading theory, and you will be the theorist. You will feel free to feel like you are doing the theorizing in this paper. That's really what it's for. It's a practice. I'm probably the first kind of paper you've written like this, but that's okay. This is what our class is for. And I would just, if you want like a kind of like a number to estimate, I would say like 90% theory, maybe 10% if you want an application to like a particular object, whether that's a text or something like that. But in reality, you don't even need that 10%. I'm just as fine with no application, just a conversation on theory. Okay. But if you did want to discuss something connected with it, that's fine. But this is not the paper where you would sort of like, here's like half on Derrida and here's half applying Derrida. So it's not that kind of paper actually. It's 90%, let's say, Derrida or whoever. It certainly doesn't have to be on one theorist. It can be on more than one. But it should have at least one person from the syllabus as its main probably thing that you're talking about. And yes, you can definitely use, if you, in terms of the presentation that you'll be doing, if you want to reuse some of that or stay on the same theorist, that's totally fine. But again, really the challenge is for you to be the theorist and to pick a topic that you think is interesting and that you want to extend, you want to know more about. And maybe it's a field, maybe you like psychoanalysis and you're like, it's something I really want to develop in my skill set. First, I need to know what some main things in psychoanalysis are that interest me and that I can sort of, I don't want to use the word master but it's not the right word, but it's to have that sort of feeling that, I'm really comfortable with some of these terms and I will sort of walk my way through them. And one of the reasons I don't use the word master is just because this stuff is so hard. These texts are very hard. And I've said that more than once. I'll repeat it just to give you a sense of less pressure on this particular paper and these texts. These are very difficult texts. If this is the first time you're reading it, it's just hard to understand what the heck is going on. Then it takes years to sort of understand some of this material. And then we have a wide variety of methodologies that we're taking a very short look at in this class. So there's no way you can just sort of sum it all up and absorb it all and so on in this first go. So I am sympathetic to that, but this is the chance to really dig a little bit deeper into something in these methods and in these conversations and texts that is interesting to you. So, it's also a chance to create a kind of theoretical thread, I would say. You can feel more creative on this side. If you really just want to say, look, I just want to understand the uncanny, that's fine. And retrace that out and sort of theorize in the bigger picture, that's totally fine. But if you want to say, well, I'm interested in developing a little bit more on what dream analysis might mean in terms of things like how dreams show up repeatedly in poems, or sort of dream language, or like sort of waking dream. The poem is waking dream, or something like that. I don't know. Or maybe the challenge that, which we barely even spoke about, which was Adam Phillips's the challenge between poetry and psychoanalysis, because they're sort of specifically poetry is the seemingly ideal of psychoanalysis. It always idolizes it, but it also decontextualizes it, and it turns it into a kind of thing that it wishes it could be, like full speech, meaningful, beautiful language, and a sense of almost like self, I guess, reparation or therapy, or I don't know, some sense of the self attaching to language in a good way. That's what poetry seems to represent for psychoanalysis. But the truth of psychoanalysis isn't always so pleasant for the clinical experience as well as, let's say, the interpretive experience. So it's just a fascinating debate, and there's a lot one can take away from just that. So anyways, I just modeled that as a quick way of thinking about this paper. It's up to you to come up with your particular interests, and as we're reading for the next week, month or so, you should really start to get a sense of what that is. On the 13th, you'll turn in the abstract, and I will pass around a paper, and I will meet with everybody individually for about 20 minutes to go over your abstract, to look at what you're thinking and to give you some suggestions and so on. It can be very sketchy, your abstract, just a sense of where you're going, but it doesn't have to be very formal. Okay, so any questions about the paper? No? Okay. I just, one last thing recommend is, I carry this trusty notebook everywhere I go, because I'm very old school, and I love writing by hand. This carries all my possible ideas in my brain. I feel like I would not be a theorist without my notebook, and I get these from France. It's very special. They have to be Clairefontaine. That's the rule. Because I love the paper and the lines and all that stuff. But what I do is I take regular notes about things I'm working on, and I have various sections and headers and that help me sort of over time brainstorm. For example, I was working on an essay on this thing called de-extinction. I wrote a book on extinction, and then there's this idea that you can revive animals. It's called de-extinction. And I started writing an additional essay on that topic. So this section says de-extinct, DX. And it's just some various notes that came to me at certain moments. And what I'll do is, like, maybe a week later, I'll come back and I'll just add. I'll read, what did I think of that week? And I'll see what I can add. Or it'll be like subtopics, like what does artificial intelligence have to do with this? And because there's the debate, are machines conscious? If so, are they somewhere between like an animal and a human? and so on. Other pages have different things. I even have a page, a running page where it's called Future Projects. And let's see what I had in mind back in the day. I was one day I'm going to write on Walt Whitman. I'm working on another project on finitude, and so on. I'm working on something else on planets. And so I variously add things in there. Sometimes I add here, I'm like, if I ever wrote a book on one theorist, who would it be? And for some reason I put Jean-François Lyotard in there because I was really thinking of some of his stuff, but I decided I'm just going to write an essay on it. There's one essay he wrote called just Can Thought Go On Without a Body? It's such a strange essay, and I just think it's so well done, so curious that I just don't even know how he wrote it. So one of the tasks I've commissioned myself is just figure out how he wrote that. So I'm going to one day visit his archive in France and see what I can find. Maybe nothing. I don't know. But we'll see. So I do that, and I just recommend you have something that you feel comfortable with. I have even a section here on method, where I write my notes on what I think about my own methods and my own interest in method. A lot of these notes are from like 4 or 5 months ago, but here I even have a section on. It says, "What are the great problems remaining in literary criticism?" So obviously that sounds familiar. That was me prepping for this class 4 months ago, and just seeing what I could come up with as I was waiting for a coffee or something like that, or drinking my coffee or whatever. And a lot of times I'm asking myself questions. I'm trying to commission thinking from myself, and encourage myself to sort of answer questions. Sometimes I listen to podcasts and I listen to the question and I think, how would I answer that question? That's the same model I use, where I'm commissioning myself to help me theorize. Because it's hard. If someone just gives you a book and says, okay, what's all right, what's your theory of language? No, I'm not going to get started. It's just way too ridiculous. But if someone says, okay, here's that Derrida text, here's that Derrida phrase, what's my take on it? And there I can start. And it's much more approachable in that way, I would say. So I just recommend, again, you have a way to write down your thoughts. I prefer handwriting. I think it's the way to go, but it's up to you. It has the default problem of that I can't search it. So if I have to leaf through the pages, but it just forces me at least to remember what I was doing in a certain way, and I think that's very helpful. And you can see your thoughts develop over time, and you can challenge yourself. You can ask yourself questions, and see where your thoughts go. All right, so that was just another little tip there about how to theorize. Okay, without further ado, some feminism. We're leaving behind psychoanalysis, sort of. There's a lot of ways it comes back to relevancy this week and many other weeks. So knowing that we have 4 texts and three presenters, I will just really jump right into it. I want to quickly just use this board to point out something that may be familiar. Your suggestion that there's 3 waves of feminism. First wave. This is can be dated to like the suffragist movement. So we would say, I don't know, like 1920. Primary focus was getting the ability to vote, but it was more than that. Obviously, it was a sort of first global flourishing of women's rights and everything from issues of marriage and property to work in the workplace, women in the workplace, women as writers, artists. We're going to see this, of course, with Virginia Woolf in just a minute. And a kind of larger scale argument about what is what is a, let's say, feminist perspective on reality or on everyday life and so on. It's bigger than just 1900, 1920, but let's just for now put it there. Second wave is considered to be, let me just make sure I wrote this right, yeah. 50s and 60s. And one very important cultural moment is Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, which is early 50s. I actually forget the exact date of that text. Wonderful, massive volume, and sort of in one text you can see sort of the history of feminist thinking and the sort of next things that have to be done in that giant text. It's such a wonderful marker. And it really explodes what we call the second wave of feminism, which is more than just rights, but it's a whole sort of alternative pathway for what it means to be a feminist, to be a woman, and so on. And specifically, escaping or entirely rejecting the model of women as other, women as certain, women as secondary, and so on. Challenging all stereotypes that were associated with women and replacing them with a more empowered sense of what it means to be a woman. Okay, so that was 50s and 60s. And just to also reiterate, this wave was so much more invested in the total transformation of life for women. Okay, from the domestic to again everyday life to women in the workplace, women in political systems, women in all facets of kind of a person's career. So third wave can be associated with the 90s. And it's more of an open question, how to sort of understand a third wave. It would be the idea that there starts to be a backlash in feminism, whether that's in the 80s, maybe even earlier. That backlash might come from rejection of feminism and a kind of return to conservatism or patriarchy. However, at the same time, there were also criticisms, very valid criticisms of, let's say, first wave and second wave feminisms. And these criticisms came from other subject positions. So, for example, queer, black, even ecofeminism, other forms of what we call intersectional, positional perspectives. And their main criticism was that second wave feminism was too much focused on white, middle-class, female subjectivity, and that it had neglected to really theorize and develop and advance emancipation for the broader category of all women globally, and the different kinds of women out there. So this category, second wave, tended to sort of think of women still as a unified category, whereas third wave feminism was much more pluralistic in what it means to be a woman, and sort of starts to be more invested in concepts of difference, that feminism and difference can go together, rather than feminism and unity. So we have texts from kind of several of these waves today to look at. One might suggest, though, there could be a fourth wave today, in the last sort of 5-10 years maybe. Is there a fourth wave? Is Me Too feminism like a fourth wave? I think one might think of it that way. However, it's clear that there are sort of multiple kinds of feminism that would circulate in contemporary situations. And then I think there's, even when we're reading something like Donna Haraway, you'll see a question of like, where is feminism going when certain tendencies are accelerating, like artificial intelligence or machines or technology, And we might also add things like environmental problems, as today there's going to be a giant hurricane, and so on. And how is feminism changed in a way that might be called a fourth wave, even in those situations? Okay, so that's just a brief map. I want to do one other big thing before we do the some readings, which is just to make a case for feminism in literary theory, more specifically, and how feminism has changed literary theory, just kind of on a general sense of how we do literary theory. So here goes for different unit. Let's think of the history of the rise of the novel. So earliest novels, late 1600s or early 1700s. And the rise of the novel is very much coincident with economic and global changes of the period. We have essentially global trade happening, and by late 1600s. And we have the rise of the middle class as well. Okay, so more people with money to buy books. They're more educated. Population numbers are growing, and maybe they have more leisure time or just more interest in. There are just more readers. Period. Okay. So there's also a growing sense of cities, let's say urban culture, and growing larger nations, and all the spread of novels really facilitates all that, or sort of ties it all together. Because the novel will be the thing that can connect people in a particular nation or in a city. You'll not ever meet these people individually at this point in history, but the novel will give you a sense that you are, let's say, in this city with these fellow characters and so on. All right, so far so good. But there's a second major motivation in the rise of the novel, and that is the idea that the novel speaks to subjectivity, and it speaks to the inside of the subject, so the interiority, in a special way. All right, so the invention of the novel is really also the invention of interiority, and the fullness of the self and the subject, really something that we totally are aware of now without almost even thinking about it. The idea that you are a person with a sort of boundless interior, and the question of you is, how does that interior connect with the exterior? And it's an ongoing question for the rest of your life. And I think that spreads with the rise of the novel. And everyone starts to sort of become absorbed in that sense of selfhood. And to that degree, the novel is sort of self-consciously aware of the internal and the external. And it has to be, because characters, you get the inside of the character at the same time as you get the outside of the character, and also description. So interiority is everywhere in the novel, as well as this question of how do we get the perspective of the inside of the character at the same time as the sort of social scene in which that character is existing. And related to that is just the idea of the importance of sentiment, cultivating taste, cultivating feeling. All this is aesthetic language of the 18th century. So, and the novel is simultaneously sort of developing that sense of sentiment and feeling and so on. And I would just say that everything I've said is what I would describe as feminist methodology. The idea that the novel is highly attuned. It's like, say, it's almost one of the most fascinating devices for mapping, if that's the right word, or just understanding interiority and feeling and sentiment and so on. That novel is able to slip into the domestic or the private realm of characters. And in fact, that's what the novel is. And that's what sort of the realism or reality is in the novel, is the ability to be inside the private space of someone, of a character, to see their inwardness, and to see their everydayness, and to see how they construct their personal relationships. That becomes the plot of literature, and not per se great historical events. One of the sort of turning point novels is Robinson Crusoe, Defoe, which is, I think, 1727, somewhere around there. Anybody know? Somewhere around there, 1720s, I'll say. I hope I got that right. And it's a novel. I hope you've read it. And I'm not spoiling anything, but it's a novel where Robinson Crusoe gets shipwrecked. And in a way, it's like an adventure novel. He calls it a history. If I have that right, I think he calls it a history or something. But it's the idea that this character goes through sort of important events that are not necessarily world historical, but they're sort of one event after another. And yet, so that sounds like the model of history. But at the same time, we see this emergence of this fascinating character, Robinson Crusoe, who is not historical, he's totally fictional, and he sort of becomes his various personalities through these different events. So who he is as a character changes each time he has these major events. And that's really the birth of the novel, the ability to see the character at the same time as you see the history. Other examples would be like Richardson's Pamela, Fielding's Tom Jones. These are very, where, in fact, very little of importance happens to these characters, and mostly it's just about their different relationships and the people they encounter. Adding to this sort of feminist understanding of the rise of the novel, or a feminist methodology applied to literature, would be the idea that, of course, there are more, people are writing more letters, and women in particular are writing more letters, so you have essentially a growth of women authorship in the 1800s, and running through, Jane Austen and so on. You have, of course, women writers are also women readers. They're reading letters. And the novel becomes based on there's a lot of epistolary novels of the 18th century, you may know this, and but of being able to sort of read cues, reading words which translate into reading cues, reading social cues, and so on. And whether it's men or women needing to learn those social cues, the literature is really developing that. So the novel becomes based on reading characters, identifying characters, reading cues. All this mixture of inwardness, outwardness, private, public, feeling demonstrated on the page, the reader's feeling, this sort of vicarious doubling of feeling over and over again. And even added to this, the idea that you start to see pleasure being spoken about in literature, the pleasure of these characters. And so as pleasure becomes sort of a modern feeling, or modernized feeling, we'll see this, Foucault will talk about this to some extent next time we read that. The novel is also developing that in more refined ways or more interesting ways. This all culminates in the rise of female protagonists, marriage plots, education of desire, education of character. It's essentially the core of the novel as it explodes in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So finally, just the history of the novel cannot be understood without the history of feminist thought or thinking gender, thinking sexuality, thinking desire, thinking embodiment, thinking sociality, thinking inwardness, and let's say the balance or the connection between the inward and the outward. And that's one big way of thinking about what feminist methodologies have done for understanding the big picture of literature. So with that, we now jump into Virginia Woolf. We don't have a presenter for that, though. This is the only text we don't have a presenter for. And without further ado, on page 857, let's read Virginia Woolf. This text is from 1929. And so essentially first wave feminism, sort of, but interesting on its own terms. So let's read the first long paragraph. We want to volunteer to read that for us.
Okay, so all the way till, well, where do you want?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, let me imagine, since facts are so hard to come by, what would have happened had Shakespeare had a wonderfully gifted sister called Judith, let us say. Shakespeare himself went, very probably, his mother was an heiress, to the grammar school, where he may have learnt Latin, Ovid, Virgil, and Horace, and the elements of grammar and logic. He was, it is well known, a wild boy who poached rabbits, perhaps shot a deer, and had, rather sooner than he should have done, to marry a woman in the neighborhood, who bore him a child rather quicker than was right. That escapade sent him to seek his fortune in London. He had, it seemed, a taste for the theater. He began by holding horses at the stage door. Very soon he got work in the theater, became a successful actor, and lived at the hub of the universe, meeting everybody, knowing everybody, practicing his art on the boards, exercising his wits in the streets, and even getting access to the palace of the Queen. Meanwhile, his extraordinarily gifted sister, let us suppose, remained at home. She was as adventurous, as imaginative, as agog to see the world as he was, but she was not sent to school. She had no chance of learning grammar and logic, let alone of reading Horace and Virgil. She picked up a book now and then, one of her brothers perhaps, and read a few pages. But then her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings or mind the stew, and not moon about with books and papers. They would have spoken sharply but kindly, for they were substantial people who knew the conditions of life for a woman and loved their daughter. Indeed, more likely than not, she was the apple of her father's eye. Perhaps she scribbled some pages up in an apple loft on the sly, but was careful to hide them or set fire to them. Soon, however, before she was out of her teens, she was to be betrothed to the son of a neighboring wood stapler. She cried out that marriage was hateful to her, and for that she was severely beaten by her father. Then he ceased to scold her. He begged her instead not to hurt him, not to shame him in this matter of her marriage. He would give her a chain of beads or a fine petticoat, he said, and there were tears in his eyes. How could she disobey him? How could she break his heart? The force of her own gift alone drove her to it. She made up a small parcel of her belongings, let herself down by a rope one summer's night, and took the road to London. She was not 17. The birds that sang in the hedge were not more musical than she was. She had the quickest fancy, a gift like her brother's, for the tune of words. Like him, she had a taste for the theater. She stood at the stage door. She wanted to act, she said. Men laughed in her face. The manager, a fat, loose-lipped man, guffawed. He bellowed something about poodles dancing and women acting. No woman, he said, could possibly be an actress. He hinted, you can imagine what. She could get no training in her craft. Could she even seek her dinner in a tavern or roam the streets at midnight? Yet her genius was for fiction and lusted to feed abundantly upon the lives of men and women and the study of their ways. At last, for she was very young, oddly like Shakespeare the poet in her face, with the same gray eyes and rounded brows, at last Nick Green, the actor-manager, took pity on her. She found herself with child by that gentleman, and so, who shall measure the heat and violence of the poet's heart when caught entangled in a woman's body, killed herself one winter's night, and lies buried at some crossroads where the omnibuses now stop outside the Elephant and Castle.
Okay, great. All right, so thanks for that read. Well done. I don't know if we don't really need to necessarily sum up what happened to Shakespeare's sister, though she seemingly would have had as similar talents, similar interests, and similar capabilities or desire to become, be it an actress or a writer or both, and but gets sort of thwarted at every step of that from her parents. Also, even before that, essentially before, she has no education. She's not going to learn grammar and logic. Not only that, is that each time that she might have had those opportunities, something else happens to sort of track her elsewhere, and that is typically going to be the expectations of female labor or female duties. And so this finely crafted hypothetical tale shows that in abundance. I guess my question was going to be, I didn't even read it, I don't know, I don't really have it as a question, but I just was going to say that notice how Woolf is sort of weaving her through this story by paying attention to issues of, say, material economic reality for writers. And we all know that a room of one's own will imply that every writer deserves personal writing space as well as a small sum of monetary support, say £500. That's approximately what she's suggesting. I forget. But the bigger picture is that every writer has a kind of material situation or material dependence, like say material economic reality to how they work, and Shakespeare had it too. And Shakespeare's sister, of course, would have been in the same situation. However, she did not have, the doors did not open for her materially or, let's say, economically. And instead, she gets constantly put into situations of female labor, which famously we know is not paid, is unpaid labor. And then, of course, as she sort of ages, she gets seduced, or then she ends up having a child out of wedlock, which is also, let's say, dangerous for the time. So she has all this sort of female embodiment factors. We would add that to what we mean by materiality. So the female body, issues of desire, family, children, care, family care, all of that becomes factors in how writing is done. And for men, they often don't have to worry about any of that because it is gender divided in terms of those expectations. But Woolf is careful to tell the story where, what if we, how would we see these show up in a case like Shakespeare's sister? And they're at every twist and turn, essentially. Okay, so what I wanted to ask, though, as a much more, I think, conversational question, is to ask you about how Virginia Woolf was making her arguments. What sort of evidence or writing style is she using to even paint this picture of Shakespeare's sister? What are some of the, I would, again, maybe the best word for that is method, but I'm trying to be a little bit more specific in the sense of what are some of the literary or stylistic strategies she's using, and what are some of, let's say, the evidentiary strategies she's using? What kind of evidence is she using? Or sort of my related questions. Tina, get us started.
Well, I guess that it's in this style of stream of consciousness, and she's using this in order to just pour out the repressed, the history of repressed female authors.
Okay.
Like she's sympathizing with these female authors, just because she had a moment of freedom for herself, just a very quick moment. Yeah. So she had the chance in order to just pour out all this.
Okay, very good. Yes, we know she's a modernist writer of fiction who uses the stream of consciousness technique, long sentences with extended either interior kind of observational phenomena or maybe plural speakers in a sentence. And this employs some of those techniques. And also the sense that Virginia Woolf herself seems to be present here as this person who has this sort of pouring out. What other word we might say is that this had been bottled up inside or repressed inside of her. This argument that she wanted to make, she had made with her own work essentially, but felt like it should be put on the page, sort of. In terms of as an essay, an extended essay, to show what is entirely involved in becoming a writer. All right, so far so good. Grace.
I feel like also in the same vein, because Virginia Woolf I find is we're very character based, so she really does a lot of work to make her characters seem more alive. Yeah. Even when it's a fake character.
Exactly.
So just expanding on the instance of her being caught by reading something.
Yeah.
She didn't need to say all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. We're going to look at a second stylistic thing in just a second, which is probably what you're referring to, where she's talking about what it's like to read same-sex female desire. In this long passage, we have a fictional character, and so she's using the tools of the writer to make her essayistic argument, her social literary argument, her feminist argument, and through fiction, and through her own example of being able to craft this kind of character. Maya.
I think she uses quite a bit of affect in this as
Yeah.
well, and I think it's more so in the form of questions that you can't answer, not necessarily rhetorical, but you know, in terms of the narrative structures, like how could she do that to her father? How could she be treated like that? So it's actually very much not only like creating but humanizing a character.
Yeah.
So I think she makes quite a lot of use of affect in it in order to actually bring that to life.
Nicely said. Yes. So we get Shakespeare's sister's emotional twists and turns, her desires as well as her and fears and exploitation and kind of misery and so on. So we get the full like affective spectrum from this little like portrait of this character. And we get also Virginia Woolf herself constantly sort of giving us affective cues from her own thinking about the loss of Shakespeare's sister, how disappointing that is. She kind of says this in the next sentences, she says that more or less is how the story would run, I think, if a woman in Shakespeare's day had Shakespeare's genius. But she says it's unthinkable that any woman in Shakespeare's day would have had that genius because women at the time were laboring, uneducated, servile people, and so on and so forth. So you get that sense of frustration, as well as sort of lost sense of hopefulness that is permeating this writing. So it's full of affective language of the characters, of Virginia Woolf's own personal emotional response to this material, and it's connecting that to, of course, the reader, which is us or anybody in the 1929, picking those things up. So, okay, so far so good. Just to recap, we have stream of consciousness, fictional characters, heavy use of affect. Okay, what else?
Just to build on Maya's point about affect, like I think, maybe it's been sort of talked around, but just her use of questioning, like her questions, her rhetorical questions.
Yeah.
Like not only is she storytelling, obviously, which is fun or easy to read or exciting to read.
Yeah, she's mixing storytelling with essay.
Yeah, but I think part of that is that she sort of pops herself, like she'll tell you part of the story and then pop herself in. Yeah. Or pop a voice in or pop a question in and say, exactly. How could she break his heart? Yeah. Right? And there's no answer and just keep moving. Yeah. So that kind of thing. Yeah. A lot of these questions are her own, or ones that she's posing to the readers, or ones that she thinks are important for us to ask ourselves.
Yeah. So blending critique with novelist or narrative like techniques. Mm-hmm. Blending literary theory with literature. Mm-hmm. Some of these questions, and it's also worth saying is these questions feel very Jane Austen-y, but we could also say they feel very literary theory. So maybe Jane Austen is the source of literary theory, rather than Derrida. In her I don't know. I keep defaulting to the word mastery, but it's not the right word. In her skilled use of all these tools and techniques, she's blending these in this essay fiction.
I was also just going to say that she's posing this hypothetical imaginary character that she's even admitting, this is what it would be if I think this is how it would go. Yeah. But she's also putting her finger on, because she's gestured to a historical period, to historical factual evidence. Like, women could not be
actors.
Yes.
The
actors would have been boys. Yep. And also, there is a career that is suggested for her, but it's only hinted at, and I'm assuming the allusion there is prostitution, that she can't be an actor, but the thing that she can be in that period, the only real economic position that's available is prostitution.
Yep, exactly, yeah. So she's giving, I asked the question about evidence. On the one hand, some of her evidence is fictional. Some of it is, let's say, literary theoretical or literary critical. Some of her evidence is historical. Some of it's materialist, I would say, historical materialist. The person who's sort of associated with that term would be Marx, but it doesn't have to be. but just using historical evidence to show that there was sort of economic pressures and problems of the time, or limits of the time. But it's not just that kind of history, it's also, let's say, a gender history. So prostitution, desire, family, that's evidence too, okay? It's not just secondary material or something like that, or background. It's evidence to construct this bigger argument. And she weaves it so impressively, so incredibly, that it just flows beautifully, and it's so transformative. So I'll just to add a tiny bit of other things that she's doing stylistically and with evidence. She is using so history as well as fiction. She's using a little bit of autobiography. When she uses first person I, as well as third person fictional characters. Okay, so first person, third person points of view. She is using, so autobiography, we'll call that. Now, next time we rejoin, we're going to look at an essay on what's called auto theory. But in a way, this is something of a version of that, auto theory. She's using anecdote, I want to say, which is sort of like somewhat historical evidence, but kind of not necessarily as stable as records in a record book or something like that. So we don't know if Shakespeare's Sisters really buried at the crossroads of Elephant and Castle. But this sort of anecdote, historic history of what happened to bodies that didn't exactly, that nobody claimed or something like that. They may have ended up at that kind of spot. So I would say anecdote. What else? Okay, so that's plenty. She's using everyday experience, Shakespeare's Sisters' everyday life experience as evidence. Also, of course, Virginia Woolf's own everyday life experience, especially through issues of having a room and monetary support. She's also, though, painting a picture of the larger historical situation of women and women writers. So it can be very sort of singular person, situated knowledge, personal experience, but also bigger historical context. And I would just say that you use all those techniques. But you probably didn't realize how complex it is to weave those together. It is. And it's a skill that you have. And I would say in part, you got it from Virginia Woolf, even if you never read this. But that's one of the legacies of feminist methodology. Think back to Derrida or Haldeman or Lacan or Freud or anything like that. They were amazing readers, but they certainly were not going to do this amount of rapid movement between fictional and historical, or first person, third person, or saturated emotional language tied to historical data, history of gender tied to the idea of literary theory. It's just so condensed and packed in here. And it is so familiar because this is the English department, but this has to be invented. So it's not just Virginia Woolf doing this. I'm overselling it a little bit, but it's so remarkable to see this right here. All right, having said that, let's take a look at one more fascinating example from Virginia Woolf. One or two other things in this text. This is on 859, Chloe liked Olivia. Let's just read this one paragraph. Anyone want to volunteer to read this one? Okay, thanks, Sarah.
I am almost sure, I said to myself, that Mary Carmichael is playing a trick on us. For I feel as one feels on a switchback railway when the car, instead of sinking as one has been led to expect, swerves up again. Mary is tampering with the expected sequence. First she broke the sentence, now she has broken the sequence. Very well, she has every right to do both those things if she does them not for the sake of breaking, but for the sake of creating. Which of the two it is, I cannot be sure until she has faced herself with the situation. I will give her every liberty, I said, to choose what that situation shall be. She shall make it of tin cans and old kettles if she likes. But she must convince me that she believes it to be a situation. And then when she has made it, she must face it. She must jump. and determined to do my duty by her as reader if she would do her duty by me as writer, I turned the page and read, I'm sorry to break off so abruptly. Are there no men present? Do you promise me that behind the red curtain over there, the figure of Sir Charles Byron is not concealed? We are all women, you assure me? Then I may tell you the very next words I read were these. Chloe liked Olivia. Do not start, do not blush. Let us admit in the privacy of our own society that these things sometimes happen. Sometimes women do like women.
Okay. I'll just read a couple more. It says, Chloe liked Olivia, I read, and then it struck me how immense a change was there. Chloe liked Olivia, perhaps for the first time in literature. Okay, so I was going to ask you, okay, what, even just a little bit more fine-grained at the level of style, what in some of these sentences stands out as, for you, that Virginia Woolf was doing to sort of help convey this scene of Chloe and Olivia? So go ahead, Sarah.
Well, I thought it was really interesting that instead of reading, like in some of the other theories, we've been reading a book that will, like a text that people will recognize, where you're referencing back to something that is a published,
Sure.
a play or a dialogue. Like she's invented a novel that she's reading, and then instead of doing the analysis of it, she's providing you with like the emotional experience of reading it.
Exactly, yes. So that's key to me. So as if we're in the room next to her reading with her, or reading in a group with her, which was common up until somewhat recently, probably still common in her time, that sort of, especially women groups of reading out loud. And it starts to probably dissolve right around, I guess, Virginia Woolf's time. Mary Carmichael, not a real author, just to double check, we know that. This is not a real story, but the text that is circulating on everyone's mind at the time is Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness, a novel which has female same-sex desire as the sort of core of the narrative plot there. Anything else though about the style? Okay, so yes, we see Virginia Woolf sort of reading, sort of pace of reading, or her experience of reading. Anything else? So Neil, and then Tim.
So I find it really interesting that her criticism, her critique, is very much in alignment with how she describes the novel. That the novel is a mix of delight and teaching.
Yeah.
And that you cannot have only the philosophical side. You cannot only have the teaching side. You need to have the delightful side so that you can actually communicate that meaning.
Yeah.
And which is something that she didn't actually come up with, but it's always been there, like with the, just as you were talking about the history of the novel, it's always been there that one of the things that distinguishes the novel from like other modes of writing is that it has that kind of emotions embedded in it, and she's doing it not only in her, like when she's writing the novel, but also in her criticism, so that she can somehow attract the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so literature, we know it pleases us as well as maybe instructs us, and but in some sense, that pleasure side of things has rarely been talked about or studied or understood, and that's first of all a feminist methodology is to sort of make pleasure a big deal. Like it just seems to have totally disappeared in new criticism, and even in, let's say, Derrida, or I mean, obviously it's everywhere in Freud. He's talking about pleasure, right? But is he really translating that to? He's sort of tracking it, and sort of explaining it and figuring it out. But that doesn't actually mean the same thing as sort of corresponding with pleasure. And that, it's not just feminism. You might say it's a queer methodology as well. I would agree with that, but it's very loud and clear that it's massively important for Virginia Woolf to sort of have subtle attention to what pleasure is for these characters, and for you, and for Virginia Woolf, and so on. Tim, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have 2 points. The first one is just that it's funny. I think is a really important part of that. The use of these like satirical, I guess, the phrasing of it that makes it funny kind of breaks it on defenses for a lot of this. Like especially with the suffragette movement, like there was a lot of like social claims that was like, oh, these people are just like they're killjoys, they're boring. they ruin our fun by talking about politics. And so, I mean, Virginia Woolf's kind of saying that maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the other thing that I think is more interesting is that she kind of forces the reader into a position. There's like two places. One is where she says, "We are all women, you assure me."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no man is going to stop reading there because
exactly, yeah. So she's totally playing on the reader.
Yeah. So and
very cleverly
forces us into like a feminine position as the reader, but also she kind of forces us to like not literally, but like start and blush at the phrase because if any of us just read the words, you know, Chloe liked Olivia without any of this context, even probably contemporary readers wouldn't have actually started or blushed at that because it doesn't have any like weight to it, but she kind of gives it to it and shows the absurdity of people who blush and start at things like the novel. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Radcliffe Hall's book is being tried for obscenity, right? And Oscar Wilde is jailed for this, and it's certainly not. You know, there are risks in talking about pleasure.
I guess my point is that the Chloe liked Olivia is such a benign phrase.
Like that's exactly.
She could have used.
We're not getting that illicit.
But she used something so benign.
Exactly. But at the same time, radical. And so she's really performing out almost theatrically this scene of reading, where she says, "I turned the page and read," and then we get our ellipses. I am sorry to break off so abruptly, and it's so clever. It's in the text. It's in the flow of the text. But she's saying, "I'm pausing abruptly here. Are there no men present? Do you promise me that behind that red curtain there's not that judge, Sir Chartres-Biron? We are all women, you assure me. Then I may tell you that the very next words I read were these." And she's sort of narrating her reading, writing the narration of the reading. So she's sort of like double performing her argument, using these very clever ellipses. So using fictional techniques, because this whole thing is of course fictional. Using these pauses, pregnant pauses maybe or whatever. Talking about blushing and so on, and all of this to sort of bring this package, which is not all that radical maybe, just a simple one character likes another character. And they happen to be both women. Okay, so I just think it is wonderful how she sort of brings us through that experience as if we are there next to her, you know, in the room. A very fictional technique. When you write an essay, in literary theory essay, you almost never use some of these techniques. Are you going to invent a fictional character? Are you going to talk about your reading and your blushing? Are you going to sort of have an open dialogue with your reader, saying, "I am sorry to break off so abruptly"? You know, would you ever write something like, "Are there no men present?" That kind of these strange questions. Would we ever use these techniques? Maybe not, but why not? That seems silly. These are all techniques that make for good literature, and as you know, I support the idea that we're all creative writers to some degree, and these are our creative tools. So it's just fascinating to me how sometimes reluctant we might be to use some of these tools. Or some people use them very clearly, but because they identify with a certain thing, maybe called auto theory or whatever. But that's such a small genre of possibility, right? There's such a bigger way that this kind of writing could be done. I don't know. I don't do much of it myself, almost zero, so I'm not really a great example. It's really hard. But I absolutely encourage it. So even if it's something you want to use in your essays, it's totally fine with me. Okay, well, just one last thing from Virginia Woolf here is on this topic of her sort of gender theory of androgyny. And very fast, since we've already spent an hour here. She says on 8621, I'll just read it here. It says, the sight of two people getting into the taxi, and the satisfaction it made me also ask whether there are two sexes in the mind corresponding to the two sexes in the body, and whether they also require to be united in order to complete satisfaction and happiness. And I can barely read anything because my eyes are terrible, so I'm going to switch to my reading glasses. So she says, And I went on amateurishly to sketch a plan of the soul so that in each of us 2 powers preside, one male, one female. In the man's brain, the man predominates over the woman, and in the woman's brain, the woman predominates over the man. The normal and comfortable state of being is that when the 2 live in harmony together, spiritually cooperating. If one is a man, still the part of the woman brain must have a defect, and a woman must also have intercourse with the man in her. Coleridge perhaps meant this when he said that a great mind is androgynous. I was going to ask you a little bit about this theory of androgyny, but I'm just going to sort of walk us through really quickly. It's clear that she thinks that good writers have sort of both maleness and femaleness in them. But what does she mean by that? She kind of gives you some examples of too much maleness in the subsequent paragraphs. Too much maleness is sort of like overly self-conscious writing. It uses a lot of I, first person, but in a sort of egoistic way, sort of self-interested in and kind of blathering kind of manner. That's when you have too much masculine in your style. Too much femaleness or womanness in one's style might be what exactly? She suggests later that, like, for example, maybe Proust is too womanly. I don't know. That seems silly. I'm a bit jealous of Proust, her contemporary. She thinks that Shakespeare and all great writers essentially have a blend of manliness and womanliness in them. Is that exactly what we call androgyny? Not really. It's not right, like exactly the right word for that, but it's a sort of double genderedness to it. She says that later on, 861 near the bottom, she says, perhaps the androgynous mind is less apt to make these distinctions than the single-sex mind. He meant perhaps that the androgynous mind is resonant and porous, that it transmits emotion without impediment. So, let's say if men are associated with reason and broadcasting, and women are sort of more interior with emotional complexity, well, it's the doubling, both of that. Finally, that it is naturally creative, incandescent, and undivided. Incandescent is one of Virginia Woolf's sort of keywords. When your mind is fully, let's say, doubly gendered, it becomes incandescent. And it sort of has this stylistic fullness that we've talked about. First person, third person, history, fiction, anecdote, bigger history, materiality, pleasure, all that embedded in it. And that would be to sort of have this male and femaleness in one's writing. Again, great writers do this. She says, skipping finally to 864, 865. She just comments on various writers being androgynous or sexless or having both. But she says it's fatal, finally on 865. Even so, the very first sentence that I would write here, I love how she draws attention again to her writing as she writes it. I said, crossing over the writing table and taking up the page headed Women in Fiction, is that it is fatal for anyone who writes to think of their sex. It is fatal to be a man or a woman, pure and simple. One must be woman manly or man womanly. So you have to be both, right? And the great mind is doubly fertilized in that sense. She says, she calls it a collaboration, she calls it a marriage, these are all metaphors. She calls it a peace, she also calls it freedom. And so it's interesting to see all this sort of birthing metaphors, creation metaphors, marriage metaphors, which we might, again, associate with this sort of feminist history, but combining into this sort of female man kind of creative flourishing. Okay, so that is Virginia Woolf. Now we turn, without further ado, to Gilbert and Gubar's text. And Grace, do you have any?
I do have a PowerPoint.
Okay.
I'm not sure how it
Yeah, so let's get that.
I have like a USB or I get it on my computer.
Okay.
I just don't know if I have the board.
You can use machine. You're welcome to sit up here if you want, or wherever you want.
Sit or like?
Stand or close.
I
Yeah,
mean,
chair.
sitting is cooler.
Yeah, sitting is better.
Yeah. I don't know if that's.
Oh, right.
Thought you would be Emily Dickinson.
Oh, yeah. All the time about Dickinson.
Okay, so whenever you are ready.
All right, so The Madam in the Attic by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Barr. Okay, so since the chapter title was infection in the sentence, I thought I'd go through 3 points of infection that you can find in women's literature. So the first one, the father or the forefathers of literature, where I'll talk about the anxiety of influence. And then the foremothers of literature, where I'll talk about the anxiety of authorship. And then lastly, I'll talk about the patriarchal socialization and like society, socialization of women and how that impacts women's literature. This is Bertha Mason, so the Madam in the Attic, just as like a sort of preface right now, comes from the Bertha Mason character from Jane Eyre. But Gilbert and Barr used this trope of the woman in the attic and apply it to how women writers were perceived sort of in general in the 19th century. So I did just want to preface, like mentioned in the beginning of class, how they're sort of looking at a narrow scope of who women writers are. So they're looking at 19th century women writers and very much lacks diversity in this selection. So I think taking everything that they say with a grain of salt, like they do sort of generalize the female experience. But I still think that there's value in the things that they propose about coming to a better understanding of like sort of the literary history of women's writing culture. But just to preface that, so something to keep in mind, how their ideas might need to be altered in a more cohesive way. But before we can talk about all of these women writers, we have to talk about this man. So this is Harold Bloom, a literary critic, who Gilbert and Barr are going to redefine and sort of rework his ideas of literary history and the anxiety of influence in a way to apply it to the experience of women writers. So first they talked about the psychology of literary history, which they define as the tensions and anxieties, hostilities and inadequacies writers feel when they confront not only the achievements of their predecessors, but the traditions of genre, style, and metaphor that they inherit from such forefathers. So that's what this first point of infection is going to be. Like the forefathers of literature, the people that all writers have to confront as like the writers of the canon, and who are mostly men. But then they sort of outline Harold Bloom's idea of the anxiety of influence. So they Gilbert and Barr define it as the fear that he, the writer, is not his own creator, and that the works of his predecessors existing before and beyond him assume essential priority over his own writing. And then further, that Bloom sort of describes this anxiety of influence as a father-son relationship, where a man can only become a poet by somehow invalidating his poetic father. So this anxiety of influence is like it's a worry about priority and creativity and like novelty, where the writer is wanting to be included in the forefathers and wants to be a precursor, and is sort of facing the challenge of doing that. But from these definitions that they give and the language that's used in Bloom, you can tell that it sort of excludes women writers. I mean, it's talking about a father-son relationship, it's talking about the writer as a man, but where do women writers fit into that? And of course, Bloom's theory is traced back to Freud. We haven't escaped him yet. the Oedipus complex, where there's this aggression from the son to the father. And they call, Grobler and Gubar call this model intensely male, which I thought was fun wording, but they still do see value in it. They explain this saying that, like Freud, Bloom brings the often unconscious assumptions into the conscious, so the assumption being that literary history is male. Instead of ignoring this, as many other critics do, Bloom defines it and analyzes it. So they say Bloom's historical construct is useful not only because it helps identify and define the patriarchal psychosexual context in which so much Western literature was authored, but because it can help us distinguish the anxieties and achievements of female writers from those of male writers. So basically Bloom, they're saying, is a really good starting point for defining the women's experience by being able to see the differences between them. And he's not wrong in saying that most of literary history is male, because that's what they sort of have to work with. This is the first quote is the J. Hills Miller quote about the parasitical presence, guests, and ghosts in literature. And they are pretty much overwhelmingly male. But Gilbert and Gubar asks the question of, like, can this Freudian Oedipedal model that Bloom proposes be just inverted to describe the experience of women writers? And do women writers experience the anxiety of influence the same way as men do, only this time they're maybe engaging in heroic warfare with the foremothers instead of the forefathers? But Gilbert and Gubar say no, it shouldn't be inverted, and they don't really experience writing in that same way, because for the woman writer, the experience of confronting the precursors is not just a worry about priority. It impacts the way of her art and her very being. So the quote here, not only do these precursors incarnate patriarchal authority, they attempt to enclose her in definitions of her person and her potential, which by reducing her to extreme stereotypes drastically conflict with her own sense of self. And this is what I see as like the infection of the forefathers, is they sort of try to put these definitions on her, but she can't cohere to them because it's not an accurate description. And in asking these questions of, oh my god, I forgot what that was gonna happen. In asking these questions of where do the women writers fit in Bloom's anxiety, I think it points us to the next section, the infection number 2, the mothers, the foremothers of literature. So maybe a better question isn't where do they fit, but do they fit at all? And again, Gilbert and Gubar say they don't. Because their precursors are so often male, and because these male precursors fully misrepresent and stifle her, women writers don't have the joy of worrying about whether or not they'll be considered strong poets, but whether or not they can be poets or writers at all. So then the anxiety of influence becomes an anxiety of authorship, which they define as a radical fear that she cannot create, because she can never become a precursor, the act of writing will isolate or destroy her. And so I like that wording of radical fear. I think it implies the like fundamental nature of their fearful and sort of precarious position in literature and in literary history, but also a reform of some sort. And then they go on, the woman writer's battle, however, is not against her male precursor's reading of the world, but against his reading of her. So the woman writer does have to radically reform, or Adrian Rich uses the word revision, re-vision. So the woman writer has to revision literary history, which she enters without having any place in it, without having any idea really how to be a writer. And then that begs the question, where does she begin? And Gilbert and Gubar claim that a lot of women writers start by searching for their foremothers, even though there are a few of them. But the woman writer searches for a female model, not because she wants dutifully to comply with male definitions of her femininity, but because she must legitimize her own rebellious endeavors. So searching for each other is like this desperation to know that it's possible to succeed. And Gilbert and Gubar start to talk about this subculture that women writers form as having its own tradition and its own history. So they're really getting away from, yeah, Bloom's model of literary history is good for men, but then women writers have to have their own model because it's so different. And they call this subculture a secret sisterhood. This is what I imagine. I think you guys know this movie. This is a good movie. But when I hear the word secret sisterhood, it sounds like a really empowering thing to me. You know, it's a shared experience. The magical genes of the patriarchy, if you will, are passed through the hands of the members of the sisterhood, and they laugh, they cry, they fall in love. But the magical genes of the patriarchy definitely don't fit everyone perfectly. So I will abandon this analogy and go to someone who never fails to cheer me up. Emily Dickinson. So, I mean, Gilbert and Gubar then go on to look at a Dickinson poem that maybe would describe, or would say that despair is a better word to use, that connects and binds this secret sisterhood together. There's definitely a dark undertone to the secret sisterhood. So here's the Dickinson poem. And of course, so she goes on to talk about the despair that we inhale. And I think that the despair that we inhale and the infection breeding in the sentence can be attributed to the usual suspects, the men who write stories and novels and poems about typical stereotypes of women. But Dickinson's wrinkled maker in here, the poet, the writer in this Dickinson poem, is ambiguous and not gendered. And Gilbert and Gubar note this, and then they write, for a while, on one hand, we, meaning especially women writers, may inhale despair from all those patriarchal texts which seek to deny female autonomy and authority. On the other hand, we may inhale despair from all those foremothers who have both overtly and covertly conveyed their traditional authorship anxiety to their bewildered female descendants. And this is why it makes sense that Annie Gottlieb would chase her mother with a knife in her dream. I think of the anxiety of authorship is like listening or watching your mother obsess over her weight and her skin and her hair and all these things that she was taught matter, and all these things she was taught that determine her worth somehow. But you know that they don't determine her worth, but then somehow you still can't help but feel that same anxiety about yourself. And it's this like generational trauma that binds the sisterhood together. So it's not sunshines and rainbows like Blake Lively would make. And that, I think, is that generational trauma is what I would call the infection of the foremother. But I don't think it's fair to say that to blame individual foremothers or forefathers for their anxiety-inducing traditions. The infection that breeds in the sentence is everywhere, including especially in just society in general and the socialization of women. So Gilbert and Gubar write, such diseases, and in this passage they're talking about the literal diseases associated with femininity, like hysteria and anorexia and agoraphobia, but I think definitely applies figuratively to the infection in the Dickinson poem. So such diseases are caused by patriarchal socialization in several ways. Most obvious, of course, any young girl, but especially a lively or imaginative one, is likely to experience her education in docility, submissiveness, selflessness, as in some sense sickening. To be trained in renunciation is almost necessarily to be trained to ill health. So these qualities that women are trained to have, they go on to say, like, run so deeply that frailty was admonished and at very least expected of women. And the patriarchal socialization is this expectation of frailty that's taught to girls who really have no choice but to grow up to be mad women and addicts because they don't have any basis to be anything else. So, some more quotes. Back to Bertha Mason. Surrounded as she is by images of disease, traditions of disease, and invitations both to disease and dis-ease, it is no wonder that the woman writer has held up many mirrors to the discomforts of her own nature. And this patriarchal socialization, which I think definitely goes back to the Virginia Woolf passage, the first part that we just read, of like how women have to live their lives in a certain way because of patriarchal expectations and everything, causes the woman writer to experience her gender as a painful obstacle or even a debilitating inadequacy. And then Gilbert and Gubar go on to note the illnesses and diseases that really often appear in the works of these 19th century women writers. So the eye troubles in Dickinson, poisoning in Goblin Market, and the Madwoman in Jane Eyre. It's like again and again these images of disease and illness come up, and it's a reflection of the actual lived lives of the lived experience of these women writers who are surrounded by disease. And they're sort of metaphors of the infection surrounding their artistic craft as well. And they become, if you read into these characters, these ill characters and images of disease in their writing, I think a way of understanding the writers themselves. So now, knowing more about the anxiety of authorship and the secret sisterhood and how it's a generationally passed down through patriarchal socialization and how that impacts the way women exist, I really like how Gilbert and Gubar describe it in terms of the Anne Sexton poem, which is on the side here. They say several passages of Sexton's verse express what we have defined as the anxiety of authorship in the form of a feverish dread of the suicidal tarantella of female creativity. I had to look up tarantella, but it is a dance, that, like an Italian dance, I think, that was believed to cure the venomous bite of a tarantula, but only when danced to complete exhaustion. So I think that's a really powerful metaphor for the experience of female creativity, especially in the 19th century, where they were up against terrible odds, as they say. And it makes me wonder, what is the point of complete exhaustion then? Where does it end? At what point do the women writers revision the anxiety that is so deeply entrenched in female creativity? The Sexton poem is not very hopeful. Anne Sexton claims that the dance only ends in death, but I think we should end on a bit of a happier note. And where you can't find so you can't find joyful images of your favorite foremothers, but you can get AI to create them. And I just wanted to include that. But I think that Gilbert and Gubar also end on a pretty hopeful, at least really useful note. And the usefulness of Gilbert and Gubar's concepts of the anxiety of authorship and this literary history model, the subculture of women writers, is a hopeful one, because they're tracing the past of our foremothers and discovering the ways in which they overcame the terrible odds. And it's the first step toward reestablishing the matrilineal heritage of literary strength and female power. So I think that Gilbert and Gubar offer us a great starting point. I mean, we've probably moved past it now, but a great starting point of getting back to who these foremothers were, and then being able to expand from that, because I think it's hard to start from nothing. And so, just to end, here's a less despairing note from Gilbert and Gubar. Women writers have seen themselves as pioneers in a creativity so intense that their male counterparts have probably not experienced its analogue since the Renaissance, or at least since the Romantic era. The son of too many fathers, today's male writer feels hopelessly belated. The daughter of too few mothers, today's female writer feels that she is helping create a viable tradition which is at last definitively emerging. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, awesome. How did you make this image? Are these?
I think I typed into Copilot. I said, give me images of. I listed a bunch of authors.
Okay, so they generated their images.
Having fun together.
Yeah. It's sort of like a vague, filmic rendition of Julia Roberts playing Virginia Woolf or something like that. That's awesome. Okay, very, very well done. That was a great look at this synopsis of this essay. And it's essentially a chapter from their book. And just reiterate a few highlights of this brilliant presentation. just to remind, like, it's not so simple that the Gobard is saying, oh, we need to read more women writers. That's, they're doing much more complex things than just opening up the canon. Of course, though, they do of authorship and of what is a woman writer as a sort of literary theoretical question. Okay, so not just by saying, oh, here's some examples. That's not enough, but it's more like how does a female writer exist as, let's say, a figure, a literary theoretical question, and how is that writing done? In part, they are borrowing from like sort of psychoanalytical literary theory with the Harold Bloom model, but as Grace wonderfully walked us through, they're doing their own substitution of that from the anxiety of influence to the anxiety of authorship, and nobody really uses Bloom's model anymore. So while it might have been sort of well known in the 80s or so, or this is 70s actually, it's not that helpful, and yet it does make sense. Like yes, of course, everyone feels some anxiety about when you're sitting down. If you're doing creative writing or if you're doing writing an essay, you always feel the weight of precursors on you. So it's not like he's wrong, Bloom. But it's also like, do I really need this Freudian model to talk about literature? It just seems so reductive or just sort of blatantly pro-Freud and blatantly patriarchal. But it's better to beat him on his own terms, to do better, let's say, psycho-literary theory, rather than just say, oh, this is nonsense, this is patriarchy. That's, okay, fine. But how about let's actually almost beat him on his own ground and say, here's a better psycho-literary theory. It's an interesting blend of psychoanalysis and literary theory with anxiety of authorship. It's not just psychoanalysis, obviously. It's more like, it's got a little bit of Virginia Woolf in it. And this also related argument of that the anxiety comes from the fact that there seems to be very few figures of authorizing women writing. So it's hard. So you're anxious because you don't feel authorized to write. Whereas the opposite for men, they might feel like, oh, the weight of Shakespeare, how will I ever match up to that? For women, if they have almost very few models, it's a different kind of anxiety. The compensation for that, almost psycho-literarily, would be this idea of this secret sisterhood of the traveling pants. And your all meme games is way better than mine, by the way. So I'm very happy to see that. That it is worth noting that like it is kind of a 1970s phrase or early 80s phrase of feminist optimism that there would be this secret sisterhood, that all women would see themselves as kind of unified under this umbrella of sisterness. And yet it's not a bad thing. It's a little utopian and it's a little hopeful. So that's a good thing. Maybe is it missing out on the complexities and differences and intersectional kind of uniqueness of different authors? Yes. So it's limited, but it's obviously is serving a purpose for their argument. Yeah, so other than that, I was just, I don't really even have too many questions since we really covered so much of the details with Grace's presentation. I will just, a couple last highlights is that they finally do close reading. They bring in literary material as evidence. So it is very familiar. This is sort of what we do and the way that you make your argument and then offer a text as an example, and you read that text and show this is how you're reading it. I don't know if, Grace, you felt that their discussion of the Emily Dickinson poem or the infection was very good reading. I was a little less convinced, but...
Yeah, I don't know. I think they do definitely read into that one like sentence.
Yeah.
A little too much.
Yeah. They'd sort of turn it into a giant sort of theory of female lineage and so on. And I'm glad you showed the poem. It's not clear exactly if how Dickinson thinks this sort of metaphor is transmitting. It's supposed to be like, I always, for some reason in my mind, I have no idea if this is the case with Emily Dickinson, but I think of Sappho and all the sort of details and sort of like burning desire that Sappho might have recorded in what we call poems, but though Sappho wouldn't have called them that. Lyrics, maybe? I don't know. It's hard to even tell what Sappho is doing. But that 2,000 later, you pick it up and it's like, wow, that intensity is still there and fresh. So it's the infection transmitted or something like that. I mean, literally, you might read Homer talking about diseases in the Odyssey or something like that. And that would be a literal transmission of an infection. But it's more of a metaphor of how, different like passing emotions or fevers or whatever might be picked up by a reader at any given moment. So it doesn't seem to me exactly corresponding to what they're trying to do with it, but it doesn't. It's fine. Their reason doesn't have to be the best in the world. And maybe the last thing I'll point out is that this is a collaborative text. These are two women writing a theory text. That's sisterhood model. It's feminist scholarship. It's collaborative. They are building on each other's ideas, supporting each other, rather than, sometimes it's overly described as like, literary theory is like a competition, this theorist versus this theorist, and they're going to undermine and tear them apart. And that's your job. If you're going to be a critic, you're going to explain why all these other people are wrong and why you're 100% right, and trash them and become the hero of your own life, as Dickens would say. But that's not necessarily the only way of doing literary theory, and maybe kind of an annoying way of doing it anyways, the idea of tearing apart everybody so that one can sort of find one's voice and one's position. And even to the degree that they're willing to entertain Harold Bloom, of all people, as still instructive, despite all his obnoxiousness. Is, I think, generous. And it just shows that a kind of generous, collaborative, thoughtful, sort of kind of sense of solidarity, if that's the word for it, goes a long way. Does a lot of theoretical work.